from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will be with us to talk about collecting a representative soil sample from your crop fields this fall, which he says needs to be tailored to your nutrient management objectives, producers. Then K-State's Susan Metzger looks ahead to the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture that'll take place this coming Monday evening here on the campus. Featured this year, National Geographic's Dimick, who will speak on the challenges of global food security. And later this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham is back, this time to talk about fall pruning of ornamental trees and shrubs. All that and more straight ahead on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Good to have you aboard once again. And comments coming here first for you, crop producers. As you manage your crops, one of the mainstays of that would be assuring that those crops are getting the appropriate amount of nutrients, and that brings in the value of soil sampling, some of which you could be conducting yet this fall, looking ahead to the next spring. We want to cover the methods of collecting a representative soil sample, for there might well be some steps that you want to reconsider. Our guest is crop nutrient specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz of K-State Research and Extension. First, though, Dorivar, why would one want to take a soil sample now here in the fall?
Eric, this is usually a good time of the year to be thinking about soil sampling and evaluating the nutrient levels in our soils and finding out if we have any limitations in terms of things like pH and so on. And typically, we're looking at the main nutrients, the phosphorus, potassium, pH, like I mentioned, and also monitoring other parameters like organic matter as we're trying to monitor organic matter. Nitrogen is another one, and this is a little bit different because in this case, what we're trying to find out is how much nitrogen we have residual left in that field after we finish the harvest. And then we can plan how much more nitrogen maybe we need to apply either the winter months or in the spring prior to planting. And so again, we're really looking at 2 different scenarios here. One is the immobile nutrients and the other ones are the mobile nutrients like nitrogen, which also going to have a different sampling protocol as well.
What would be the absolute essential steps to take here in drawing a sample that does show you in precise terms what you have out there nutrient-wise in the field?
Yes. First of all, the question is what nutrients are we looking at? Immobile nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, pH. Those variables are typically measured at the surface sample, so we want to collect typically a 6-inch, 0 to 6-inch sampling depth following K-State recommendations. Some labs typically recommend 8 inches, and again, the key here is that we have to be consistent in that sampling depth. Typically, when we are looking at these nutrients like phosphorus and potassium, we are trying to manage this in the long term because it's really something that can change depending on yield levels and management over time. So we want to develop history of these nutrients over the years. And if we're looking at multiple years, we want to be consistent in terms of sampling depth. And that's very important for these nutrients, especially if we're talking about, for example, no-till systems, where we do have some stratification of these nutrients and we may have higher concentration near the surface. So again, if we are changing or if we are not being consistent in how we collect those samples in terms of sampling depth, then we will be introducing variability there as we are looking at the data over time. And so it is very important to be consistent there. The other scenario is for mobile nutrients, like we mentioned earlier, like nitrogen. And if we are looking at that nutrient, then we really need to be evaluating how much nutrient we have in the profile. And typically, we will recommend a 24-inch sampling depth. Some soils, like in southeast part of the state, maybe we have more shallow soils, and in that scenario, of course, we will collect the sample depending on the depth of those soils. And again, many producers may be collecting 18, 12 inches. And again, that's okay. The key here is that we're trying to evaluate how much nitrogen we may have in the root zone, basically whatever will be available to the roots of that crop in the next season. So again, two different scenarios here, two different nutrient types, and again, consistency, especially for the immobile nutrients, phosphorus, zinc, potassium. Consistency is really a key here, especially for no-till systems.
Now, you receive this question all the time. How many cores does one take to arrive at a decent sample from a given field?
Yes, and this is a very common question, like you mentioned, and essentially we need to find a balance here. Obviously, the more cores we collect, the better, because we're trying to overcome the variability that we have in the field, and as we are collecting more cores, that variability obviously tends to be lower. However, it is difficult to collect too many samples, and it's not economical, and it's time-consuming. So we do have some recent study reevaluating this issue, and we find that typically if we are collecting cores, around 15 cores in a given field that we're trying to manage, that typically tends to reduce the variability significantly, and it's still manageable to collect about 15 cores. Ideally, if we are getting to about 20 cores, as we really where we want to be. And so again, it is important to take the time and collect the number of cores to minimize that variability for that particular field that we are collecting. And it's important also to keep in mind that this number of cores will apply the same if we are trying to manage a 40-acre field or if we are doing grid sampling. Because essentially what we're trying to manage here is a small-scale variability. Nutrients like phosphorus can vary a lot if we're just moving a few feet away, and that's really the variability that we're trying to manage here. We're really trying to collect enough cores to have a good average for that sampling area. So for those doing grid sampling, we still need to collect a fair amount of cores here to try to have a good estimate of that area, which typically in a grid sampling may be representing 2.5 acres. And so again, it is important to still collect the number of cores here.
Well, the pattern, to put it that way, by which a producer would collect those cores, that will differ depending on whether it's a standard test or a grid sample as well, will it not?
Yes. And again, if we are collecting for a field that we're managing in a uniform field, typically we want to collect a representative sample, try to cover most of that area. It's very common, for example, for producers to walk in a zigzag pattern, basically to cover the areas in the field. That's one approach. But we also have to keep in mind that if we do have some areas of the field that tends to be different, perhaps different soil types, or we do have some different history, we want to keep those separate. And this is very important. Even if we're not doing a grid sampling approach, fields that tends to be bigger, we may want to think about separating those fields maybe in 2 or 3 different areas, just to account for any different soil types or management history. Anything that we notice that seems to be different, it's important to keep those separate. Because if we do have some differences, they're more likely maybe affecting nutrient supply, yields, and again, that will be reflected in your soil test results. So we want to, even if we're not doing grid sampling, if all possible, evaluate the field before we go there, and again, maybe consider splitting the field in a couple, 2 or 3 different areas if needed. Again, some fields may not need to do that. But again, if we do notice some differences, then we need to separate those.
I want to ask also if one has typically been banding their fertilizer applications as opposed to broadcasting those, do the sampling methods change there?
Yes, and this is a common question, especially for producers doing strip till, where we are putting all the fertilizer, of course, with the strip till operation. We do have, obviously, some areas, specifically if we're putting, for example, phosphorus with a strip till. We're going to have bands, basically, where we have high concentration of phosphorus. The challenge with that is that if we know where these points are, ideally we want to go back and collect sample from those points, as well as samples outside of that band where we apply the fertilizer. However, in reality, it's very difficult to go back and collect samples exactly where those bands were placed in the previous season. So we have done some evaluation in this case, and what we find is that the best, perhaps more practical approach is to collect more cores in those fields where we know we have history of band application of fertilizer, strip till management. We want to collect essentially more cores and try to, again, still develop an average value for that field. That's going to determine how much fertilizer is going to be needed the next season.
Now, local extension agricultural agents can assist you producers in the sampling procedures and submitting those samples if, in fact, you intend to do so to the K-State Soil Testing Laboratory. But as far as submitting those cores for analysis here, what do producers need to have in mind, Dorivar?
Depending on the analysis that we're going to be requesting, we mentioned nitrogen as one possibility. In that case, we typically want to make sure and submit those samples immediately, especially not leaving those samples sitting for too long. If we're not going to be able to submit the samples immediately, we typically recommend that we air dry the samples, essentially put it on top of perhaps a clean paper. Try, of course, to avoid any potential contamination. We want to avoid that. But let it dry, or keep it in the fridge, for example, lower temperature. That's also help to maintain the quality of that sample as we are submitting to the lab. For other nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, pH, we do have a little bit more flexibility. But again, typically, if we are submitting as soon as possible, we are minimizing any risk of potential issues with the analysis.
And we're talking here about a core composite, so mixing those cores together.
Yes. In that process, of course, we want to mix everything. We want to get a representative sample. So typically we collect multiple cores. We mix it very well in a clean plastic bucket. We want to avoid any contamination in the whole process. In terms of the tools that we are using, the sample bags, everything needs to be clean and avoid any potential contamination in the whole process. Multiple cores, well mixed. And again, that's ultimately what's going to go to the lab, and it's going to be analyzed by the lab. Again,
though, taking soil samples in the fall can be very useful to you producers. Dorivar, many thanks to you.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension, on this part of Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today and setting aside a few moments for a full preview of a special event this coming Monday evening on the Kansas State University campus, the continuation of the Henry C. Gardiner Lecture Series. It's the Global Food Systems Lecture, to be precise. Along with us now is the Senior Executive Administrator of the College of Agriculture here at Kansas State University, Susan Metzger. Susan is tasked with organizing this particular event every year, so we've invited her by to fill us in on the lecture series itself and whom will be presenting it here in 2019. Susan, remind us of the origin of this lecture series, which is named after a stalwart in the beef cattle business here in Kansas.
Absolutely. The Gardiner family own a major Angus operation in southwest Kansas, and in honor of Henry C. Gardiner, the family elected to endow this lecture series, and so this is our 6th year hosting this lecture here at Kansas State. So we're really honored that the Gardiner family entrusted the College of Agriculture with this lecture series. And really what they wanted to aim to do through this lecture series is Henry C. Gardiner was a man of curiosity. He believed in questioning the world and learning from it. And so the goal of the lecture is to present information about the challenges of our future of our food and agriculture systems and allow an audience to have, be provoked by that information and walk away and be curious about expanding the dialogue.
It really is not a pedestrian series. It does get into topics that have considerable depth to them. That's the purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is coming up this Monday evening, and actually there'll be activities prior to the lecture, which we'll talk about as well. It'll be at McCain Auditorium here at the Kansas State campus. And whom is presenting the lecture this year?
This year, our lecturer is Dennis Dimick. For those not familiar with the name, Dennis is an emeritus environmental editor with the National Geographic magazine, and his work, his entire career with the National Geographic is really centered around the way that humans interact with their world, especially as it relates to food and fuel.
He's perfect for the purpose of this lecture. He worked for 35 years at Nat Geo. Interestingly enough, Dennis actually grew up on a sheep and hay farm in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and he holds degrees in agriculture and agricultural journalism from Oregon State University and the University of Wisconsin, respectively. So you could fairly say he's more than passively acquainted with production agriculture. And he's bringing a message about, and this is the title of the lecture this year, Living in the Human Age. Susan, what is that about?
Yeah, so probably more than 20 years ago, the concept of an Anthropocene or a human age, this new geological era where it really begins to recognize that humans have had an impact on our world, on the globe. And so Dennis is giving us a chance to look through his art, his photography, and see what that living in human age looks like. What has our human impact looked like when it relates to growing food, producing fuel, and how has that changed over time?
So he has a perspective on this through his work. In fact, he did a series in Nat Geo several years ago looking at this, and the series was titled The Future of Food, and it looked at global food security. So he'll be talking in that vein, right?
Absolutely. This his lecture on Monday really springs from that work, the Feeding the Planet, and looks at the fact that today we have a current population of 7.5 billion people, and we anticipate a growth by the year 2050 to 9.5 billion people. And so in that series through National Geographic, he began to explore what are the challenges in meeting that obligation of feeding a planet that is rapidly expanding at that rate. And so through his artwork, he'll show us what those challenges look like, from our changes in freshwater systems, deforestation, all of the things that kind of come with the challenge of feeding an expanding population.
It's to stimulate thought, this lecture, and this particular presentation fits right into that mode.
It's to stimulate thought, and one thing that Dennis really clarifies too is it's to stimulate hope. That by having this information, we have the opportunity as audience members to walk away and to thoughtfully think about how to change that trajectory for the future.
And in that, those attending are invited to bring their thoughts, and there'll be a chance for interaction with Dennis as part of the lecture series.
Absolutely. So all of the lectures end with an opportunity for ample questions from the audience, and all of our lecturers have been really generous with their time in entertaining those questions. So it's not to just sit and hear a lecture and be entertained, although that's certainly a wonderful part of the evening. But if there are thoughts and questions that are provoked by it, we welcome the audience members to pose those questions.
It'll make for a great opportunity for exchange and for hearing ideas on living in the human age, as it's entitled. Now, he will be, Dennis, accompanied by a colleague, very familiar here in Kansas, also logging many a year at National Geographic, Jim Richardson, and they will be presenting a special display near McCain Auditorium that folks can take in prior to the lecture.
Absolutely. So Jim Richardson is a native of Lindsborg, Kansas, and was a colleague of Dennis at National Geographic, and they will be co-hosting an exhibit together at the Beach Museum. It'll be open to the public all day before the the lecture on Monday. But both Dennis and Jim will be accompanying their artwork at the Beach Museum at 4 o'clock. And so anybody's welcome to come meet with Dennis and Jim and see the exhibit. Those who have not seen Jim's work in Feeding the Planet, some of the most beautiful pictures of agriculture and food production that you've ever seen.
When we use the phrase world-class photography, that's not a stretch, Bonnie.
Absolutely.
It's absolutely phenomenal if you've not seen that. So that'll take place at 4 o'clock at the Beach Museum adjacent to McCain Auditorium. Then the lecture starts when?
At 7 o'clock p.m.
Very good. And as with the Henry C. Gardiner lecture, every year this is a free event for folks to come in.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful opportunity to bring anybody, community members, any age group, to come and participate in this event. I think this particular lecture will appeal to a wide audience, and McCain has ample seating. In the past, this lecture has attracted about 1,000 people, and so we certainly hope that this year is no different.
And it likely will not be different. It will be a good draw for folks to take in what Dennis Dimick has to say. Again, the former executive environmental editor for National Geographic, some 35 years working for that magazine. He will be the 6th speaker in the Gardiner Global Food Systems lecture. Coming up this Monday evening, October the 14th, 7 o'clock, McCain Auditorium is located toward the south end of the campus, if you're not familiar. And there is more information on a website if folks would like to follow up, Susan.
Absolutely. The best way to find that information is just to Google K-State Gardiner Lecture, and that's Gardiner, K-State Gardiner Lecture, and you'll find all that information.
Excellent. Looking forward to this, and we appreciate the preview right here. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
She is Susan Metzger, the Senior Executive Administrator, K-State's College of Agriculture. Again, the latest installment of the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture Series coming up this Monday evening. Dennis Dimick, formerly of National Geographic, the presenter. 7 o'clock sharp, McCain Auditorium. We do hope to see you there. Taking us up to the break, want to let you know about another unique opportunity that'll be holding forth here on the K-State campus. This in the latter part of November. After nearly 2 years of planning, development, and implementation of a cattle disease traceability infrastructure, the Cattle Trace program is inviting all beef industry stakeholders to attend the first ever Cattle Trace Industry Symposium. This is set for Friday, November the 22nd at the Student Union here on the K-State campus. This event is an opportunity for all involved in the beef industry to provide important feedback on cattle trace. Participants at this symposium will get a first-hand view of a mock trace demonstration, along with a unique perspective of traceability in the United Kingdom, including Scotland's experience using UHF technology, that from Dr. Andrew Moxley with the Scottish EID program. There will also be a discussion on the economics of traceability and interactive breakout sessions to allow attendees to provide guidance and feedback about the future of disease traceability in the beef industry. The symposium is free. The registration deadline is November the 7th, with the registration link and a more detailed agenda available at cattletrace.org. And just to remind, the Cattle Trace Pilot Program evaluation has begun. During the entirety of that, approximately 90,000 calves in Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and other states will be tagged with a UHF ear tag. As those calves move through the supply chain, minimal data, including an individual animal ID number, GPS location of the readers, and the date and time, is captured and then maintained in a secure third-party database. The Cattle Trace team started to conduct mock traces late this past summer to test that infrastructure and determine its effectiveness in tracing cattle movements in the event of a disease outbreak. This symposium will be the first opportunity to get a glimpse of the database in action. Once more, register by November the 7th at cattletrace.org for this first Cattle Trace Industry Symposium, November the 22nd, on the Kansas State University campus. This is Agriculture Today, and we'll return shortly here on the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Coming your way now on This Agriculture Today, our weekly time set aside to talk horticulture. And in the guest chair this time around, K-State horticulturist Ward Upham, with strategies on pruning landscape trees and shrubs, what to do and what not to do. We bring this up, Ward, because a great many people look toward the fall as maybe the time to trim back or otherwise correct those landscape woody ornamentals. And is it so?
Not necessarily. Now, you can take off 10% of any plant, any woody plant, any time of year. You're not going to hurt anything by doing that. However, there are some problems we can run into by pruning at this time of year or even earlier in the year than this. Just remember, deadwood doesn't count.
Okay.
So you can take out deadwood anytime it shows up, and it's not going to count as to how much pruning you've actually done. Okay. The other thing is that when we talk about pruning this time of year, most years you're going to be able to get away with it. For those years where we're going to have a hard winter, we can see some real damage in those winters. And since you don't know what the winter is going to be, it's just wise to be a little bit careful about pruning at this time of year, or actually, as I mentioned earlier, even earlier, like pruning in July and August. That is going to encourage some new growth that's going to be more sensitive to winter damage. And so it's better just to not do any extensive pruning at that time of year.
Let's expand on preserving the winter hardiness of, and start with trees. You really have to watch that, although those trees may be of a stature that one would think, well, they are sound, they've been growing for 10 years or so, they are hardy, but maybe not so.
Yeah, again, it all depends on the year. So if you do any pruning at this time of year, what you're going to do is reduce that winter hardiness. It won't reach maximum winter hardiness if you prune. Again, that's over 10%. If you don't prune, they will reach maximum winter hardiness. Now, what we're concerned with when we talk about winter hardiness is actually 2 things. One of those is the actual extreme cold temperature. You know, if we have a very hard winter, gets extremely cold, especially plants that are just marginally hardy could really be hurt. So we want to preserve that winter hardiness. The other thing we're concerned with is a really sharp drop in temperature from one day to the next. For example, in November 10th in 2014, we went from 69 degrees during the day to 19 degrees that night. And though you didn't see any damage early in the spring, you saw it all through that next summer. Those plants were not hardened off. That hardening off process is gradual. And so what you want to see in the fall is a gradual drop in temperature, not a really sharp drop. In 2014, we hadn't had much cold temperatures before that point, and having that sharp a drop really caused some real damage. And if you had done some pruning at that time of year, that damage would have been more extensive.
Have to ask you, though, Ward, if one waits until that major drop, 19 degrees, for instance, then prunes, is that going to be harmful to the tree as well?
It could be. Again, it depends on the maximum cold temperature at that time. Also, you never prune any plant, any woody plant, if it's below 20 degrees. What you're pruning then is going to be frozen wood, and that in itself can be damaging. So, again, it depends on the winter. But as a rule, it's just better to wait till spring.
Same notation for shrubs, though, or is there more latitude in as far as pruning may be here in the fall?
So in shrubs, we have a little bit different deal. All the things we just said still apply, but you have some other considerations you have to take into account. For example, our spring flowering shrubs, a thing about lilac and forsythia, we usually recommend that they be pruned after they flower. Now, it's not going to hurt them to prune even earlier. It's just that what you're doing is removing some of the bloom you could have enjoyed. And so you can prune them earlier if you want, but it's just better to wait so you get the benefit of those blooms. Now, if it's a shrub that either doesn't bloom or blooms in the summer, then it's better to just do your pruning in March. They're going to put out new growth, but that new growth is going to be that which flowers, and so you're going to be fine in that case.
And some folks ask you about this, the option of what's called hard pruning, and that is really cutting that plant back. Based on what you've said so far, that's not a good candidate for this time of the year either.
That's right. So what you want to do is do that pruning in March. So we're talking about, again, certain shrubs that can take that. Juniper is an example of one you can't. Because once you expose dead areas in that shrub with a juniper, it's going to stay. It doesn't fill in. And therefore, if you have a large overgrown juniper, it's best to just pull it out and start over. If it's not that point, you can do some minor pruning, but just don't leave any dead areas. Those that can be cut back hard would include things like spirea, forsythia, pyracantha, sweet mock orange, shrub roses, flowering quince. Those are all some of our, in many cases, older shrubs, and they're tough. They can take that. When I say cut back hard, I mean you cut them back to 6-inch stubs. Now, they're going to recover, but they probably won't flower that next year. No. You're going to get a lot of growth, but that next year they're just going to be flower-free, so to speak. The year after that, they should start to come back.
But again, in the cases of those you just listed, best in the spring?
Best in the spring. Usually what I tell homeowners is prune in March. You actually have a little bit more latitude than that, but if you prune in March, you're going to be fine.
Again, though, unless you're mildly trimming that plant back, less than 10% of the plant material. And if you are inclined to do so because you have a shrub that may be overgrowing and blocking a part of a walkway, say, you can stay within that 10% limit. You still need to follow good pruning technique, do you not?
Yes, and so you always prune back to a bud or to another branch. In other words, you do not leave a stub. A stub is going to die, and a stub is going to act as an entry point for either insects or disease. So just using those good pruning practices. Also, it's a good idea when you prune back to prune to an outward-facing bud so the growth doesn't go back into the bush. And that way you can keep that bush from getting too filled in the middle.
So remember those practices we preach quite frequently when it comes to ornamental pruning. But once more, be patient and wait until springtime, in most cases, Ward.
That's right. It's always better just to wait till March if you're going to do some hard pruning.
Very well. Thanks for covering this with us. We always appreciate the input.
You bet.
Ward Upham along with us, horticulturist, K-State Research and Extension. That is this week's horticulture segment, bringing today's edition to a close. Again, we'd urge you to take full advantage of our podcast service. You can listen to each day's broadcast at your leisure. You can also have that podcast automatically downloaded to your mobile device. To look into all of that, go to agtoday.net. Again, at agtoday.net. In the meantime, we appreciate you being along with us right here today. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.